In this video, I'm going to discuss 5 tips that will help you with your airbrushing. Let's get into it right now. Tip number 1, holding your airbrush. So which way you hold your airbrush is totally up to you. I'm just going to show you my preference and how I do it. Now you can see this one's got a sloped trigger, so it's a little bit different. What I actually like to do is instead of running my finger like this, it creates more action through there when I'm pulling back. Whereas I find that when you put your finger over the front like this, it's just a bit easier. You don't have to pull back as far. It does take a little bit of getting used to, but this method was actually shown to me by Drew Blair, and it's definitely made a lot of difference for me when I'm airbrushing. So I tend to switch between the two, but generally I'll have my finger over the front like so. I've seen people use their thumb. Whatever works for you is what I recommend. The other thing I like to do is use both hands. So grab your other hand, and that's going to help you steady the airbrush when you're moving left and right to do lines, or if you're doing some fine detail work. Using 2 hands definitely helps. Another thing I like to do, especially when using a heavier airline, is I like to run it around my wrist like so, and that takes a little bit of the drag away from the airbrush when it's just hanging down. Now let's say you're using a gravity feed airbrush with a straight up and down trigger like you see here, rather than the slanted trigger that I showed you earlier. You can see how really you've got more room there, and it's a lot more comfortable to have your finger resting over the front of the trigger like so. So again, depending on what airbrush you're using will determine how you hold it and whatever's comfortable for you. If you prefer working like this, then by all means do so. Now let's say you're using a siphon feed brush like this, where the jar sits underneath. I like to hold onto the jar, again run the hose along my wrist like so, and using 2 hands with that jar gives you a bit more comfort. And again, you've got no cup obstructing this area at all, so you can really hang your finger over the front and get nice and comfortable with it. So that's how I like to hold a siphon feed brush, and you can definitely use this jar as an advantage to hold onto and keep the airbrush nice and steady. And the other airbrush that I have, which I use from time to time, is a trigger brush like this, and obviously with that one it's self-explanatory how to hold it. Just grip it like so and use your finger on the trigger. Again, to make it more comfortable, I like to wrap the hose around my wrist like so. Tip number 2, mastering double action. So you can get both single action and double action airbrushes. Single action airbrushes definitely have their place. However, I use double action airbrushes at all times. They are trickier to get the feel for to start with, but once you do, then you can achieve all sorts of artwork. To master your double action, what you need to do, and this is going to feel extremely weird to start with, is press down for air, keep the air press down at all times, and then pull back for paint. You can see I've just got some reducer in this brush, so you can see nothing's coming out, and then I pull back for paint. You also want to pull back and then return the trigger to the start position and then let go. Don't go like this and let go. That's going to allow some paint to sit in the front of that nozzle. When you press down for air, it's going to shoot on your work. I'll give you a quick demo and then we'll move on to the 3rd tip. I'm going to remove the air cap whilst I'm painting. I don't like having it on, but just be careful not to drop your airbrush. So what you want to do is air on at all times, paint on, paint off. If you want to do a fine line, paint on, paint off. Paint on, paint off. What you don't want to do is find the paint, wait, then move, and then stop. You also don't want to use it where you're going like that and letting go, right? So what I'm doing is pulling back on that trigger and then letting it go. And when I press down for air, you can see it spiders out on me. So again, paint on, paint off. Paint on, paint off. Paint on, paint off. Paint on, paint off. And I'm always using that double action trigger. Just to give you another perspective, just watch the trigger finger, paint on, paint off. Air is on at all times. So I'm not letting that air go. Paint on, paint off. And then that way I can get nice smooth lines, and even when I'm coloring in, it's nice and even. So always remember, air on at all times, paint on, paint off. Tip number 3, tip drying. So if you're painting flat out, and especially if the temperature is fairly humid, you are going to get what's known as tip drying. It's a normal thing, and you may just see it on the end of the needle there. There's some blue paint buildup. It's going to continue to build up faster if you're not using the correct double action technique as I showed you in the previous tip. To illustrate the tip drying a lot quicker, what I've done is I've just used paint that hasn't been reduced, and I'll incorrectly paint with it. So you can see I'm not shutting off the paint properly. I'm going on and off. And usually beginners experience tip drying a lot more frequent because they aren't using the double action correctly. And you may just be able to see that there is a buildup of blue on the end of that needle, and that is the beginning of the tip drying. And what that's going to do is, if I'm painting away, you can see how if I'm trying to pull a nice even line, it's going to start to go a bit intermittent on me. Can see, especially through here, it's not that bad yet, but after more and more painting it's going to be more and more evident. So there's a couple of ways that you can minimize your tip drying and clear it a lot quicker. The first one is with the needle exposed, carefully, and I mean carefully, use your fingernail and pick off the paint, and that's going to help to clear it, and then you can blast it out a couple of times. I would recommend using this method for airbrushes that have a 0.5mm needle or something like a 0.35 like what I'm using here. Even though I do it on my microns, just be very careful because those needles are extremely fine. They're 0.18 and 0.23, and if you're too aggressive with your picking, you can damage the needle. So just be careful of it if you are going to use this method. A safer way to clean it is to use something like this, a cotton bud or Q-tip. So you can see this one has a rounded end as well as a pointy end. Either will work, but I prefer using the pointy end. You can get some water, reducer or airbrush cleaner and just squirt a bit on there and then carefully clean that off. And then the other end you can use to dry it. And you can see, even with me picking off a bit of that tip drying earlier, you can see what is left on there. And remember, the tiniest amount will obstruct your airbrushing. So if you are having trouble, tip drying could be one of the issues. The other method that works pretty well is using something like a paper towel. You can use it dry if you wish, fold it up a couple of times and just kind of poke your needle in there. Or better yet, put some of the solution on there and then go ahead and do so. And that's a safe way to clean off your tip drying nice and easily. Again, be careful though, don't be too rough with it because the needle is delicate, okay, so you don't want to damage it. Tip number 4, blasting out. If you're painting away and again you get your tip drying happening, which is inevitable, a good way to clear it off with an airbrush with a solid handle like this is to unscrew the handle, loosen the locking nut. You don't have to completely unscrew it, just loosen it a little bit, and then that's going to allow you to pull the needle out. Press down on the air, pull the needle out a couple of times, and what that does is it's just going to dislodge any dried paint that you may have stuck up in the fluid nozzle. Once you've done it, make sure that the needle is all the way forward, otherwise you're going to get paint leaking out and it'll go into single action mode. And then the most important part is tighten this up so that when you pull back you are getting paint coming out and you can continue your painting. So you need to remember to tighten that locking nut. If you don't, I'll be pulling back on the trigger and nothing's happening. Once you've tightened that up, you're ready to continue painting. If you have an airbrush with a cutaway handle, which is this part here, what you can do to dislodge using one of these, you just press down for air, pull back on the cutaway, and that's going to clear anything out. And tip number 5 is a quick tip about flushing through the back. So if you're using one of these tabletop cleaning stations, you flush through the front first, clean out your cup after you've tipped your paint back, providing you can tip your paint back, meaning it hasn't been compromised. If it's just got some reducer or something in it, I'd recommend then tipping it in a separate container and you can keep that as a pre-mixed ready to use color. With these tabletop cleaning stations, they're great for just flushing through the front like so, but when I'm flushing through the back, I like to use just a little plastic container underneath. What you need to do is remove the handle, loosen the locking nut, carefully pull the needle out, and what you will find is paint will actually begin to travel up the back of this needle. So if you don't flush through the back, then you're not really effectively cleaning it, and this could eventually get dried paint on it and seize up in your airbrush. So what I like to do is using the squirty bottle, just flush through the back like so. I'm just using water, just water-based paints. You can spray a bit on the needle as well, and then grab your paper towel, wipe away when you're cleaning the needle. All right, so you don't want to go the other way, and just make sure it all runs clear. But really, the purpose of this tip is to show you that once you've cleaned through here, with any of your airbrushes, you should always remove the needle and flush through the back. When you're finished, reinsert the needle carefully, tighten that up, the handle back on, and you're ready to go. So for more detailed videos on the tips that I discussed in this video, be sure to check out some of the videos in the description below. And you can also take a look at these videos here. They're going to keep helping you to better your airbrushing. And until next time, go grab your airbrush, do some amazing artwork yourself, and I'll see you again very, very soon in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.